I love your feet because they have wandered over the earth and through the wind and water until they brought you to me. Our feet carry our journeys. They hold our stories. From the first steps we take through childhood and into adulthood. Every step records a sound. Every step holds a memory. It's through our movements our lives grow and change. And it's our feet that carry us through all life's joys and pains. This is the sound of Little Feet, a podcast about identity and family, orphans, foster care, and adoption. A little bit of wonder and awe, and the power of healing through play. These are the stories of people like you and me, and the journeys all of our feet have traveled to be here today. For a few minutes, just put everything down and come with me. Let's go on a treasure hunt together, and let's just see if we can find ourselves some gold and diamonds. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Sound of Little Feet podcast. I'm your host, Matt Miller, and each and every week I will share conversations that challenge and encourage. I won't ever downplay the pain and suffering, nor ignore the joy and beauty. I seek to create a weekly space that resonates and that reminds each of us that our journeys have purpose, even if we haven't discovered that purpose for ourselves yet. With all that being said, before I start having conversations with guests on this podcast, I feel like I first need to be vulnerable and open with you and share about my experiences and what led to the origin of this podcast. Asking you to tune in each week and asking my guests to share their personal and sometimes painful experiences requires a lot of vulnerability and trust. And in order to do that, I first feel like I need to first show you my vulnerability and my openness, so that together we can go to places that may not be comfortable, but they're paths that we know our hearts need to travel on here on this podcast. So today, here on episode number 2, will be a personal conversation just between me and you. This is honestly going to be a little long, but if you stick with me to the very end, I promise you'll get to know my motivations, my intentions, and the reasons why I created the Sound of Little Feet podcast. As a side note, back in 2015, I made a film called Family, which I will link below on this channel, and in which certain parts of this conversation are covered in that film. So after listening to this conversation, if you want to hear more about a certain person that I mention here, most likely you'll be able to learn more over in that film. Again, the film's called Family, and it's already up on the YouTube channel. So here it goes. My father is the reason why I am here in Japan, and he is also the meaning behind why I created the name The Sound of Little Feet, and I'll share more about that in a few moments. My dad was born in 1947 in post-World War II Japan. He was born in Sasebo, Nagasaki, which was the largest seaports at the time in Japan. That port became one of America's home bases in Japan during the American occupation. and still today the American Navy is located in Sasebo Port. So many sailors, came and went throughout the American occupation in the port of Sasebo, Nagasaki. Throughout that time, there were a lot of children born whose fathers were from the Navy and whose mothers were Japanese. And while I can't speak for each and every story or each and every person, the fathers who were shipped into Sasebo and then shipped off to somewhere else, a lot of them did not know that they were going to be fathers-to-be before they had left. And also, a lot did know they were going to be fathers and still left anyway, not wanting the responsibility of being a father. For many of the Japanese mothers, they found themselves in a really difficult position. They were unmarried and they had children that were not fully Japanese. And for many Japanese citizens, these children were reminders of Japan's defeat and also of the current American occupation. As a result, a lot of these children found themselves homeless on the streets, fending for themselves, or dropped off on the doorsteps of the Sasebo orphanage. Many moms, like my father's mom, kept their sons for as long as they could until it became too difficult to raise them. My father lived with his mom until he was 5 years old. She married a Japanese man probably a year and a half after my father was born, so that man became my father's stepfather. But unfortunately, my father's stepfather was an alcoholic, and he was also a very abusive man. The orphanage was keeping track of all the mixed roots children that were being born and growing up within Sasebo, and keeping track of some of the children who were living in more unstable and dangerous situations. My father happened to be in one of those situations, and so the orphanage approached my dad's biological mom actually a couple times, asking her if she would pretty much hand him over to them so that they could take care of him and give him a more stable environment to live in. My dad's mom actually declined at first, but realizing over time that if my father were to stay in the current situation that he was in, he would have a very difficult life growing up. So one day, my father's mother took my dad out for a walk, and they walked to the orphanage. The missionaries gathered around my father and were giving him attention, talking to him, actually just trying to distract him, when he turned around to see his mother walking away without him. My father was 5 years old at the time, and that's the last image he has of his mom, of her walking away without him. My dad would spend the next 5 years living in that orphanage. One of the care workers there at the orphanage, her name was Eiko Mitsutomi. She helped watch over my father there. And I want to go off script right now and say, side note, that actually Eiko is the main subject in my film Family, and she is a very important part of my family story, but I don't want to talk about her that much here, or it would take another hour to explain so many other details. So for now, I'm just going to keep Eiko's story very brief and say that she was a care worker who took care of my father. But in fact, she was much, much more, which again, you can find out about if you watch Family. I'm going to skip ahead in time and then go back again in time. But right now, I want to fast forward to 2010, and I am actually at Eiko's house down in Sasebo, Nagasaki, and we're having a conversation. And Eiko is sharing with me how timid my father was when he first entered the orphanage. She said when he first arrived, he was so timid and so quiet, always watching the space around him. He was so careful with his steps that she and other care workers would sometimes not even hear him come up to them. And I would later find out that that timid nature was more for reasons of caution and for fear. My father was always looking out for his stepfather, and it was that conversation with Eiko that inspired the name and the meaning behind the sound of little feet. Up until that time, I never really thought of children's feet as being very quiet. I thought of their feet being more adventurous, bouncy, authoritative. Well, that conversation really stuck with me in a way that some of the other conversations didn't. And so I began to actually really pay attention and notice the way that people walked in various circumstances, especially children. I started to spend a lot of time around children's homes, orphanages in Japan, and was really, in the beginning, paying attention to their feet and watching the way certain children would walk. And I realized that, wow, each step and each sound, they held a story. Stories that we may or may never know about, but stories that are definitely impacting the way they're living out their lives currently. And then taking that back to my father, like my father's feet, they hold so many stories. His feet have journeyed through so many different time periods and so many different decades, so many different places, so many stories that I will never know of and tucked away deep in his heart, untold to anyone. And of course I want to know these stories, but I also know that they're too painful for him to revisit. Now, going back in time, my dad's living in an orphanage. He would actually kind of break out of his shell once he became more comfortable and confident that his actions would not have negative repercussions. And so he actually became a very adventurous boy who loved the outdoors. And in 1957, at the age of 10, my father was one of the last children within a group that were allowed to leave Japan and enter into the US as newly adopted Americans. He learned English, he adapted to American life. By most accounts, you would say that my father, he made it out, he survived. He found and navigated his own way through to make for him what he wanted out of his life. He married, had 2 children, and built his future. For a long time, at least from my point of view as his son, it all appeared to be fine. But my father comes from a generation in America where you don't discuss your feelings. And unfortunately for my father, he had a whole lot of very strong, unpredictable feelings that he repressed at a young age. So those wild and untamed feelings that every child feels and that most children learn to work through, my father was never shown how to use those feelings, how to work through those feelings, how to hold them, how to channel them. And he was also trying to survive. So he did what he instinctually knew how to do, which was shut those feelings off, push them down, push them away. And he carried on. He carried on into adulthood. But by the time he was an adult and he had already lived all these years and he had never really learned how to emotionally process so many deep feelings, it would only be a matter of time that something big would happen to him, as it does with everyone in life, that would cause him to have to face some really strong feelings again. My father would later be labeled with a detachment disorder, and I'll talk about that a little more in a couple minutes from now. Growing up, I knew that my father was adopted and that he was half Japanese, which makes me a quarter Japanese. And I always thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I'm a quarter Japanese, but I had no idea what that meant. And actually, it meant nothing to me because I really knew nothing about Japanese culture or Japan at all. My father never talked about his childhood. The only thing he ever said is that he was grateful to God that he was allowed to be adopted and come over to the US to become an American. My father had this whole other life that he lived in Japan until he was 10 years old. But none of us knew anything about it because he never shared it with us. So in 1996, a major event happened in our family. So in 1996, my mom found out she had breast cancer. And so she began chemotherapy and radiation treatment. And as many of you know, chemotherapy and radiation can be really tough on the body. And it was tough on my mom. She had a hard time. So did all of us. I was only 16 at the time. My brother was 13 at the time. We weren't really sure how to support our mom. We all dealt with this as a family, not as a family, dealt with it separately. And it's still hard for me to talk about because we haven't, as a family, worked through the pain and the rift it caused in our family. And since I'm not my dad, and I can't say for sure what my dad went through, I can only say what my dad went through from my perspective, from my mom's perspective, my brother's perspective, and from the doctor's perspective. But like I mentioned before, my father has never dealt with his emotions. He's never dealt with a lot of scary feelings. He's good at repressing them. He's good at ignoring them. But this time was different. This time it was too much for my father, and he emotionally shut down. He didn't know what to do. He detached himself from his emotions, and he threw himself into work. But unfortunately, my mom was in need of his strength and emotional support. My brother and I were in need of it. At the time, I didn't understand what my father was going through, why he was acting the way he did, what happened with my family, and I was filled with a lot of sadness. And I mean, now it's been 21, 22 years, and looking at it from this perspective, of course my father wasn't going to be able to make it through that. Of course he didn't know what to do. Of course he shut down. He's never been given an outlet. He never had those opportunities to talk about his feelings, to talk about love, to talk about loss, to process that. And if you aren't able to process your pain, negative consequences are going to show up eventually. I mean, my father was still there, but he wasn't there, you know? My family was still together, but we weren't together. I always thought my family was perfect, to be honest. I always thought my family was like the family to model after. You know, we loved each other, we did stuff together. My family loved all of my friends, and they took all my friends in who needed help. But then when this crisis happened, we weren't able to be there for each other. And we haven't been there for each other since, in the way that we were before, or at least I felt before. Again, fast forward in time to 2005. It's been almost 10 years since my mom's battle with breast cancer, and she's actually, at this point, had to come back, and so she went through the whole process twice and survived. But my family wasn't the same family. Pain of 10 years ago was still leaking everywhere, and I could feel that deep sadness in all of our hearts. You know, now 22 years later, I understand so much more and able to look at all that pain and all that hurt from a different perspective, because I've researched the effects of trauma so much more now, and I've been educated in so many different ways that even though it's still painful, and even though it's still hard to fully acknowledge or fully live with, I understand it. And the way I channel my pain is much different than it was before. So still in 2005, I was living with all of my best friends in this amazing house on the border of Pomona and Claremont, down in greater Los Angeles area. And I was standing in the back room next to the pool table by myself when something happened. I can only say this situation has only happened a few times in my life, but each and every time it has been a very clear, unforgettable moment that would answer itself later on. Never right away, it would always be a couple years later, but it would answer itself later on. So this is where I may lose some of you. But have patience with me and label it however you need to label it. So, side note, I don't like talking about my religious beliefs very often publicly. It's just, I don't think it's very useful. And I think I'd rather just live what I believe out by my actions and not by preaching it. It's just not me. So what I want to say is that I was standing next to my pool table in my back room, and out of nowhere, and I really mean out of nowhere, I heard this voice in my head, which I'm going to call God. You can call it whatever you want. Call it my unconscious trying to process the 10 years of pain that I've been trying to process, or whatever you want to call it. But I heard this voice from God saying, "Write Aiko." and ask her if you can go visit her in Japan. Write Eiko and ask her if you can go visit her in Japan. And I knew right then and there, it's clearly what I needed to do. And I did. I wrote her, and soon after, a reply was sent back saying, please come visit me in Japan. So in August of 2005, I would go to Japan for the very first time. I would get to meet the dentist who took care of my father at the orphanage, the hairstylist who cut my father's hair at the orphanage. I would meet men and women who were children growing up alongside my father at the orphanage. I would get to spend time with Eiko after she told me story after story after story about all the children and about my father. And most importantly, Eiko had recently come in possession of all the photos ever taken at that orphanage. And so she had, I don't want to say hundreds of pictures of my father, but she had quite a few pictures of my father in different scenarios throughout his time, throughout his 5 years there. And I was able to piece together my father's childhood, amazing moment. And I knew at that time that that visit was not enough to contain all my newfound curiosity for what I had discovered about my father and what I was learning about Japanese culture and Japanese people and Japan. So in 2006, I moved to Japan and my real journey began. So from 2006, I spent as much time trying to connect with Eiko as possible, working on completing a history of the orphanage with her. She really wanted to organize all the pictures and write each child's individual story and have that as a document to someday give to each child. So I began helping her put that together. But also during that time I became severely depressed. Not because I was in Japan, I loved my time in Japan, but I was drifting further away from my family. My father would come visit me in Japan. I really didn't like myself, let alone love myself. I didn't know what I wanted to do after Eiko and I completed the book, so I just really felt lost. But the only thing that kept me going was this gut feeling in my heart saying that this is part of the journey and it's leading somewhere. It felt like it was leading nowhere at the time, it really did. But my heart was saying it's going somewhere. So I just trusted my heart even though it was going through a really dark period. So in July of 2010, through a series of circumstances that led up to this, I found enough courage, mostly due to the fear that if I didn't do this now, the fear of regret and the fear of missing out would haunt me the rest of my life. This thing I wanted to do was weighing heavy on my heart, and it had been weighing heavy on my heart for some time, and I felt that it was the key to find healing for my father's heart, to be honest. And that was to begin the search to look for my father's biological mom. You know, I had no idea if she was even alive, if there were any relatives around. I knew nothing. I just had this strong desire, and it was weighing really heavily on my heart. And I knew if I didn't do it now, I probably would never do it. So I called upon my dear friend Helen and asked her if I could talk to her father. So Helen's dad, by chance, was stationed in Sasebo when he was in the Navy himself, and happened to be the director of Center for U.S.-Japan Studies and Cooperation at Vanderbilt Institute for Public Policy Studies. And he was even honored with a very prestigious award, the Order of the Rising Sun, in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the mutual friendship of Japan and America. So I reached out to Helen's dad, Dr. James E. Auer, and asked him if he would help me begin the search to look for my dad's biological mom. He agreed. And it's crazy now to think about the decision to act, how quickly that decision can change your life for better or for worse. So between that phone call and honestly just a week later, I found out everything that I ever wanted to know regarding my father's biological mom. My dad's biological mom was alive, and so were his half-sisters and half-brother, and I was just invited to their house to meet them. This all took place within a week. Years of wondering, years of thinking, years of conversations with my mom. And all it took was me asking Dr. Auer and him making a phone call. And that process beginning. And within a week, I was sitting across from my dad's biological mom, having a conversation with her. To this day, I still don't have words to express what that meeting meant to me, what that whole day was like, and how it impacted me and my family. Some things you just can't put words to. And I would get to visit her again 2 weeks later for my birthday. And it was the greatest gift. I felt, this was the reason why I came to Japan. Now that I have met my dad's mom, I have the key that's gonna help unlock my father's pain and help him process and finally move through and beyond all the years and all the years of sadness that he has built inside his heart. I was the bridge that was going to bring my family back together. Unfortunately, none of that happened. My father, in fact, got really angry with me and really upset that I had found his mom. I hadn't lost hope yet. My dad was angry, but I feel like it was only a matter of time before he was able to eventually acknowledge the situation and that he would come to Japan. I really still felt like he was going to come to Japan and he was going to have a reunion with his mom and we were going to have a beautiful, happy ending for our family. So that was all happening in August. Fast forward a few months later to Christmas and New Year's, I go back down to Sasebo, Nagasaki, to go visit Eiko and to go see my biological grandma. So I'm staying with Eiko during this time. So I'm back in Sasebo. I'm super excited, hanging out with Eiko. We're talking about so many different things and just catching up. And she received a phone call the night before I'm supposed to go meet my grandma, my dad's half, my uncle, and my aunts. In that phone call, they told her that they wish to no longer have any contact with me, and that I am to cease contacting them from here on out, and that I am bringing shame to the youngest daughter and her husband's family for digging up the past. And basically it was also told that if I don't stop contacting my biological grandma, and if she doesn't stop contacting me, that the youngest daughter and her husband's family would cut her off from the family. So it was either cut me off or she gets cut off. And she was 90 at the time and dependent on their family, and she'd only met me twice. So the decision was made to cut me off. And it was one of the hardest nights of my life. Again, a night that I'll never forget. It was snowing in Sasebo, and it was actually snowing quite heavily. I went out for a walked it off, and I tried to process what was happening. And the snow was so thick that you really couldn't hear sound. It was capturing all the sound. And so I began sobbing, and I sobbed, and I sobbed, and no one heard me. But I sobbed for a good hour or two, and I just walked and walked. Eventually I made my way to a local grocery store. But I think probably bought a 6-pack of beer, went back home, got drunk, fell asleep. That night hurt so bad. It felt like every gut feeling I ever had related to Japan was wrong, and my hopes of healing my father's heart and healing my family's heart were dashed, and my belief, I don't even know how to explain. It just hurt, and I felt like a failure. During the beginning of 2011, I found myself again battling depression. I had hope that my father would come to Japan, and that he would meet his mom, and that us all reuniting in Japan would begin the new chapter in our family. And it never happened. I felt lost, and I felt confused, and I felt like everything that I had instinctually felt to be true suddenly felt like I was betrayed. So I felt like I was lying to myself. I had suddenly just lost my desire for a lot of life. The glimmer that Japan held for me was tarnished. I was angry with Japanese customs and this idea of shame and secrets and bloodline. I was mad at myself for thinking that I was following my heart, which was the right thing to do. Why am I in Japan? What am I doing? Where am I going? What is this all about? What's the meaning in all of this? And I didn't have an answer at that time. You know, the sadness built up so much that I think it's probably around February. I just said enough was enough, and I had to release this pressure that was building up inside me. So I put on my Nikes and went for a run. I ran and I cried. I ran and I cried and it felt so fucking good. And so I started running day after day, running and crying. And then slowly running, crying, and then feeling joy, and feeling thankfulness, and feeling grateful for being alive, and running and crying and feeling joy. And this happened every day, again and again. And soon I found myself enjoying running for the first time in my life, enjoying what running was doing to me, was giving me. It became my therapy. I didn't know any other way to just get everything out and to feel better. But somehow running was answering my prayers. Running was allowing me just to breathe out and breathe in and breathe out. And come home every day feeling better about myself. And that's all I could ask for at that time in my life. It's March 2011 and 3/11 happens. The Great Japan Earthquake and tsunami. It hits northern Tohoku area of Japan, which is north of Tokyo. While I'm in Tokyo, up north, the tsunami is about to reach land and take away so many lives, and including the close relative of my first guest that will be on this podcast next week. It was a hard time for Japan, but it was also a time that not only Japan but the world came together to support the Tohoku area. Suddenly, all this aid was flooding into Japan, and all these organizations and charities were popping up, and people were asking for volunteers for this and for that. And I began to hear about so many organizations that either just formed or I had never heard of before, but now we're getting the attention because there was an opportunity to give assistance. And so I was getting to connect with various people and various charities and various organizations that were focused on supporting children. And it was during this 1 to 2 year period that I began shifting my focus from my sadness and my family to how can I get involved in some of these organizations to help children who were affected by the earthquake and tsunami, and also just children who were living in children's care homes around Japan that I was learning about at this time. It was also during this time around 2011, 2012, as I was learning about these organizations, I was also learning about what was in place and what wasn't in place in terms of support for children living in institutional care homes within Japan. And as my focus shifted from my sadness and realizing and accepting that I can't change anyone else's heart, I can't change my father's past, I can't bring healing to his heart, but I do have an opportunity in front of me to help these children right now who I have an opportunity to impact their lives and to possibly even help them process their trauma, help them to work through their trauma. And if I can't change my father and I can at least love these children and give them opportunities to keep their hearts open and to hopefully be able to work through some of the pain before they potentially close their hearts off to themselves and to others. I started doing research on trauma counseling in Japan and figuring out and finding out if it was available within the children's homes and if so, how often it was provided, and realizing that it's not really provided, but there is a counselor or two within each children's home in Japan, but they only come every so often, and they usually come and all the children go together in a group and discuss things in a group, and it's very surfacey and very infrequent, and those counselors often get transferred to different places, and so there's no stability and there's no chance for these children to to even build trust with someone when talking about their feelings. And that was really breaking my heart. So my attention became fixated on how could I provide therapy to children in Japan. Counseling and therapy in general in Japan is a big stigma. And so I really didn't see how I could solve that problem, let alone if I could, how could I scale it? So my thinking kind of transitioned into video games. Because video games is such a huge part of Japanese culture, that I thought it would be less of a stigma if game therapy was used within hospitals, children's homes, and with children in general who were working on some kind of traumatic event. And knowing about the research that is still being conducted at USC with virtual reality and AI, with veterans living with PTSD, and how it's being used with them, I thought, why couldn't something like that be created for children living with trauma? Why couldn't a journey-based game with characters that these children can immerse themselves in, help guide them through their own trauma, and help them work on each of their own individual pain points, and help them to actually go through and work through that over a period of years. And I still believe in this project with all my heart, but I know nothing about creating games, and I know nothing about AI and virtual reality and how you track all of this. So I with all my heart believe somebody's going to create this, and they're going to do it within the next 15 to 20 years, and it's going to help children around the world. And whoever you are, thank you for doing that. I want to be a part of that, but right now it's over my head, and I don't know how or who to even team up with. So, I created that project. It's called Shinichi's Heart. I still have it. I have a lot of things going on behind the scenes with that, but I can only give my attention to that during my spare time. And right now, to be honest, I don't have any spare time, so I don't have any time to continue to invest in that project at this moment. But I deeply believe in it. And then I began thinking about, well, I can't do the Shinichi's Heart on my own unless I have millions, if not billions of dollars to do all the research. And I need to do something for me that I love, and I want to be a part of something that I love and that will also help others. So I wanted to make a candle company because I love candles. Candles have been a part of my life, and actually candles are a form of therapy for me as well. Lighting a candle is very calming to me. And it really allows me to think clearly. So I formed a company called Hikaki Candle Company. And Hikaki means spark, meaning I wanted to spark ideas in people's hearts, spark ideas in children's hearts, spark a new journey in children's hearts, begin that healing process, get them to go on that journey, even though it may be painful, but to begin, and using this business as a way to funnel profits into buying a large building that would be a multi-level building where the first floor, basement floor, would be the business. We make the candles. Second floor would be the common area, the kitchen area. Third floor would be for mentoring, workshops, studying. The fourth floor would be for all the 18-year-olds who have just turned 18 and who have to leave government institutional care homes, for them to live for 1 year as a transitional housing, where they're learning about business in general and how it runs. They're making the candles. They're living with other 18-year-olds. They're as a team, depending on each other. They are getting mentorship, and they're getting seminars, and they're learning, they're studying, and working on their own business model, their own goal, whether that is to go to university next, start their own business next, do something next, I don't know, whatever it may be. But this place where 18-year-olds can come together and have a time before they're out on the streets on their own. They turn 18, they graduate high school at 18, and then they need to leave the homes. And unless they really have their shit together, which most of them don't because they're emotionally, mentally, psychologically at least 2-3 years behind their peers, they have to go out, find a job, find a place to live, figure out budgeting, figure out what it means to be responsible, what it means to be adult, find new friends, do this, do that, all on their own. That's nearly impossible. That's sometimes hard enough with children who have parents, who have supportive families. How does one navigate their way through life not having the skills to do it? And my desire is to build this business. We sell the candles. We make as a premium candle company. These are beautiful candles. They're handcrafted, they're handmade. They are gorgeous. They are worth every penny. And we sell them at a premium price. And a big percentage of this goes back into the company, which then it goes into mentoring and housing and teaching these kids and getting them ready for the next step. And that was also too overwhelming for me to do by myself, at least right now at this stage. I deeply love this idea, but just right now, financially, I can't carry all of this on myself. I need backers, I need investors, I need people who believe in this vision, who want to join me on this vision. And I haven't found those people yet. So I had to put Shinichi's heart to the side. I had to put Kikaki Candles Company to the side. And while I am completely 100% sold on both of these ideas and believe in them, this one, Shinichi's heart, will take years and years. And Kikaki Candle Company, unless someone can help fund this as a startup, I just can't see it happening right now when I still have to work a full day job and financially take care of myself. But while both of these ideas are like, it's really here at the top of my heart, two quotes were deeply just circling around my heart and my thoughts at the time. The first quote is by Brene Brown, who I deeply respect and admire. And she was quoting someone else, but what she quoted was, "You have to be brave with your life so that others can be brave with theirs." And when I heard that for the first time, you have to be brave with your life so that others can be brave with theirs. It meant there was no other way, there was no other option. I had to follow my heart. Even if it meant living a life that made sense to no one else, I had to be brave with the thoughts that I felt and the feelings I was feeling. And so I came back to everything that I felt before I moved to Japan, and then all the things that I experienced while living in Japan, and came back to, I'm here for a reason. I still don't know that reason. I have to be brave in the decisions I make and not accept the path that others have chosen, and not accept that the path that others are offering me if it's not the path that I'm supposed to take. That means saying no to a lot of things, but knowing it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, it just matters what I feel and what I believe. The second quote is by Mick Eblin from Not Impossible. What Mick said, and he might have said this, pick this up for someone else, because I've heard this quote since then many times from various people, but it was the first time I heard it was in his book, Not Impossible. And he said, if not now, when? If not me, who? And that just was an arrow that pierced straight to my heart. Not be brave, and I can ignore my heart and I can go do something else, or I can try to put on an image that I'm this person or that person. But then when? When do I become me? When do I become brave? And when do I say yes to my heart? And if not me, then who? Who's going to do this? Who else has my story? Who else cares this much about children? Cares this much about playing, about imagination, and about healing? And who has my particular skill set with filmmaking? And who has my particular way of seeing things? So if not me, then who? If not me, then no one. And if not now, probably never. And so out of this, the sound of little feet was born. I decided I would make a 3 documentary trilogy. The first being called Family. It would be more of a documentary diary about my family. The second being about the current situation here today in the world with vulnerable children living in orphanages and in institutional care homes and foster care, and their situation, and what's being done and what's not being done and what needs to be done. And the third and final film would be about future technology. Would it be about Shinichi's heart? Would it be about the future of technology and the emergence of therapy and counseling and new ways of treatment to help children who are living with trauma? And I called it the Sound of Little Feet Trilogy, with the hopes of connecting with individuals around the world who grew up living with trauma, who still have trauma, but who want to help tomorrow's generation. Slowly, that's evolved. I've received so many messages and had so many conversations with people over the last couple of years. And if I'm going to be completely honest, my deepest passion is for both children and adults to live wholehearted lives, living with dreams inside them, pursuing dreams, still exploring, still going on adventures, still using their imagination, still discovering things, and still playing each and every single day. I don't know why I am the way I am, but everyone who knows me knows I'm kind of a child at heart. It means so much to me, and it breaks my heart so much to see children and adults void of the imagination and void of adventure and void of dreaming. And there's nothing more I want than to heal each and every heart and give them the opportunity to go on an adventure, give them the opportunity to dream, give them the opportunity to play again. So while this podcast is going to talk about a lot of serious things, it's also going to be about wonder and awe, about dreaming and playing and discovering. We all need that, and we all deserve it. If you found anything of value in this conversation today, and you feel like it would resonate with someone that you know, please share it with them. This past week, I already received a handful of emails over on the Sound of Little Feet website regarding episode 1 that they listened to, and they shared their story with me. So thank you for sharing your story with me, and I will write each of you back. And if you want to support us, the highest form of support that you can offer me right now is to subscribe to this YouTube channel, subscribe to the Sound of Little Feet, like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on iTunes, and spread the word. But for today, iTunes and Stitcher, our accounts have not been approved yet, so we have to wait a few more days until those are live. From next week, we're going to begin having podcast conversations. And my first guest, like I mentioned earlier, this person's family member unfortunately did not survive the tsunami. And this person's story, it's a tough story, but I really look forward and I'm honored to share this podcast with you next week. Since next week is Halloween on the 31st, Wednesday, I'm going to do 2 episodes. A quick episode on Tuesday the 30th, just be a quick 5-minute episode. And then on Friday, November 2nd, I'm going to share that full episode of my first conversation with someone. Also, next week, I have several big announcements to make. See you next week.